When the lights dim and the rehearsed smiles fade, a different monarchy rises, one stitched together by ego, ambition, and buried betrayal. In a stunning moment of private rebellion, Princess and has slammed her foot on the royal brakes. And the shock? It isn't Camilla standing beside her, it's Catherine. Before we uncover why this single move could redraw the entire royal hierarchy, make sure you're subscribed, because what comes next will shake everything you think you know. Long before the public sensed the rumble beneath the crown, faint murmurs had already begun creeping through the Windsor corridors. Behind the polished gestures and scripted unity, a hidden storm had been brewing, one and could no longer pretend wasn't there. This wasn't about tradition anymore. This was about loyalty and lines being crossed. For months, and had quietly watched Camilla's shadow stretch wider than the late queen ever intended. Reports trickled in of deliberate positioning, Camilla inching toward symbols meant for those who earned their station, not those who landed there through circumstance. Whispers drifted through palace walls, discreet jewelry viewings, pointed speeches, confidential inquiries to royal archivists for garments tied to history. Some dismissed it as harmless modernization. But to Anne, it felt like an unauthorized coronation, one carried out in silence, one that threatened the very legacy her mother spent 70 years defending. Behind velvet-lined doors, tensions thickened. Aides noticed, and stillness turning colder, her gaze sharpening whenever Camilla's name surfaced. She began skipping informal gatherings. Those closest to her murmured about late-night strategy meetings in Buckingham's smaller chambers, and a handful of her most trusted staff, and a single folder stamped with the Queen's crest. What was said in those rooms was never logged. But the urgency in Anne's stride, and the strain tightening her voice, told the real story. Betrayed a storm she could no longer cage. For decades, Anne had been the steel spine of the Cairo Palace, disciplined, loyal, and impossibly discreet. But something inside her had shifted. It wasn't merely Camilla's expanding influence that unsettled her. It was the creeping fear that her mother's final intentions were being buried under politics, ambition, and quiet manipulation. As Camilla's shadow grew longer, Catherine's light was being deliberately dimmed, pushed into the background despite carrying every trait the crown once demanded. Anne saw it with painful clarity. Catherine wasn't just the future. She was the living echo of everything the late queen stood for. And yet, piece by piece, that legacy was being overshadowed. What pierced and wasn't palace maneuvering. It was the betrayal of heritage. She had served under her mother, honored every tradition, and protected the monarchy through storms. Now she watched those sacrifices being traded for convenience. And for the first time, she contemplated breaking the sacred silence she'd upheld her entire life. But what snapped inside Anne? And why has Catherine become the one she now shields with royal fire? It started with one symbolic choice, Camilla's plan to commission a new royal portrait wearing Queen Mary's diamond crown. But in a dynasty where every jewel carries history, Camilla's decision detonated a silent conflict. And had reached her breaking point. What the public saw as a tribute to continuity and modern royalty was, within palace walls, interpreted as a calculated land grab. Camilla's request wasn't about wearing a crown. It was about claiming sovereignty through symbolism. This was not the coronation crown she had previously worn. This was Queen Mary's legendary diamond masterpiece, an artifact tied to the most sacred chapters of the Windsor story. A crown reserved for women whose authority was forged through endurance, not convenience. And Camilla understood that perfectly. Her team had reportedly spent months maneuvering behind the scenes, courting portrait artists, stylists, and curators. What should have stayed confidential conveniently leaked, sparking a media blaze her camp made no effort to extinguish. Royal watchers immediately sensed the undertones. This wasn't a portrait. It was a visual coronation. And those closest to and knew the second she read the announcement, the ground beneath the palace shifted. For decades, Anne had upheld the unspoken code of royal restraint. But this wasn't restraint anymore. This was betrayal. The symbolism of that crown meant everything to her. It had rested on her grandmother's head, then her mother's, through the grimmest trials of the monarchy. It stood for duty, sacrifice, and moral authority earned over a lifetime. In Camilla's hands, that meaning felt hijacked. To the public, she appeared as a gracious woman honoring tradition. But to Anne, it looked like a quiet redirection of succession, one that erased the values her mother fought to preserve. And wasn't the only one disturbed. Inside the palace, whispers hardened into tension. Even Charles, long supportive of Camilla, was said to have urged her to reconsider, suggesting a less incendiary choice. But Camilla refused to step back. According to palace insiders, her reply was icy and final. Let the portrait speak for itself. But that defiance came with a cost. Catherine, who had carried herself with quiet grace despite relentless pressure and flashing cameras, was noticeably excluded from every discussion tied to the shoot. She appeared composed in public, but her growing silence told another story. She understood exactly what was unfolding, and she knew exactly who was tracking every detail. Princess Anne. Charles, ever the reluctant referee, attempted once more to restore harmony. He arranged discreet meetings, placed gentle calls, and even suggested postponing the portrait entirely. But the damage was already done. Camilla had etched her boundary, and found herself again witnessing her family barter away legacy for image. Only this time, she refused to fade into the background. But Anne wasn't planning to murmur objections behind closed curtains. She was preparing a move bold enough to rattle the monarchy's very identity. In a moment unlike anything in modern royal memory, Princess Anne shattered the long-standing code of royal silence. And with a voice known for its steadiness, she chose to defend, not Camilla, her sister-in-law, but Catherine, the woman Anne believes carries the true heartbeat of the monarchy's future. What followed was nothing short of earth-shaking. It happened during what was supposed to be a routine, harmless gathering, an internal briefing on upcoming public duties and formal appearances. But beneath that calm agenda, tension simmered and had run out of patience. According to those present, the room had barely settled when Anne rose, her face unreadable, her voice sharper than anyone had ever heard. Then came the sentence that would echo through the palace for weeks. Catherine holds the Queen's legacy, not Camilla. The weight of that sentence landed like a blade. The entire room fell still. Even Charles was struck dumb. The air tightened with shock, betrayal, and truths no one dared voice until now. No one, absolutely no one, expected Anne, the family's anchor of composure and secrecy, to deliver such a brutal, public revelation. But she had been pushed past her limits, and her loyalty was finally visible for all to see. Camilla, who had entered the briefing confident and composed, reportedly turned ghostly pale. The blow hadn't come from the tabloids or critics or royal watchers. It came from inside the family, from the one woman whose devotion to the crown had never once been questioned. For Camilla, this wasn't a strategic loss. It was a wound. She had relied on Anne's neutrality, if not quiet approval. The emotional impact of Anne's words was swift and catastrophic. Insiders claim Camilla exited the room abruptly, brushing past aides who tried to console her. She wasn't just shaken by the declaration, she was shattered by the realization that the Queen's eldest daughter may have never truly accepted her at all. Charles, trapped in the middle of the emotional battlefield, found himself with nowhere to stand. For years, he had walked a tightrope between duty and affection. But now, with an openly challenging his wife's symbolic authority and invoking the Queen's legacy, he had no diplomatic escape. He attempted, as always, to pacify the storm, suggesting that heritage could be shared, that each woman held a separate place in royal history. But the breach was already carved deep, and wasn't voicing a personal opinion. She was echoing something collective, something ancient, a royal conscience resurfacing. Catherine, seated quietly near the edge, was visibly touched but remained steady. Those present say she gently urged and not to intensify the moment, trying to ease the tension. But Anne refused. She turned to Catherine and said, "You may stay silent now, but the nation already sees you." That single line shifted the entire gravitational pull of the royal family. Catherine was no longer merely the composed daughter-in-law or the elegant Princess of Wales. In Anne's eyes, and soon in the eyes of the public, she was the monarch in spirit, even if the title hadn't reached her yet. This was not petty family drama. It was a recalibration of power in the royal court. And had just declared that her loyalty would never be chained by rank, marriage, or politics. Her allegiance would be guided only by legacy, integrity, and by the one who truly carried the crown's soul. But as the tension of that explosive confrontation settled, the palace had no idea that Anne's next move would go far beyond a spoken warning. Locked away for years, a letter from Queen Elizabeth resurfaced, one intended for Princess and alone. But what lay inside wasn't a simple personal note. It was a quiet, explosive royal instruction, one Anne now feels compelled to honor, even if it reveals a secret the crown buried long ago. The letter had been hidden among the Queen's private possessions, stored in a secure Balmoral drawer accessible only to and after her mother's passing. It was handed to her in silence, no ceremony, no cameras. What Anne discovered inside shifted the ground beneath her feet. It began with tender reflections, a monarch speaking to her only daughter, two women bound by responsibility, sacrifice, and decades of unspoken understanding. But as Anne continued reading, the tone changed. The Queen, famous for her restraint, chose her words here with piercing precision. She wrote of the future, of a day when the world would look to the women of the crown not for their rank, but for their character. And then came the sentence that stopped Anne in her tracks. Should that day arrive, look to the one who carries it with dignity. To outsiders, it might seem poetic. But to Anne, it was anything but. Her mother had been watching, judging, quietly assessing who among them truly upheld the values she had guarded all her life. And Anne knew instantly who the Queen meant. Not Camilla, driven by status. Not someone who stepped into the House of Windsor amid turbulence and scandal. But Catherine, the calm center, the steady presence, the woman who never sought a crown yet carried herself as though born of it. And reread the letter over and over, her hands trembling. The words weren't what shook her, it was the timing. The Queen had written them during one of the family's darkest chapters, shortly after Harry and Meghan's departure, when the monarchy itself felt unsteady. In her mother's eyes, Anne now realized, the future of the crown wasn't about lineage or technical hierarchy. It was about virtue. And Catherine had become the embodiment of that quiet, unbreakable strength. For Anne, this wasn't about preference. It had become a command. The Queen left no decree, but something far more sacred. A final intention. A final warning. Anne reportedly cried alone that night, the letter shaking in her grasp, the silence around her thick with realization. Her entire existence had been built on duty, on service, on loyalty to an institution larger than herself. But suddenly, her sense of duty had evolved. If she stayed silent, her mother's voice would be lost forever. If she acted, she would unleash a storm across the royal family. But Anne had already chosen her side. With the Queen's words now burning in her chest, she was ready to confront Camilla in a way the monarchy had never seen. As the portrait scandal spun out of control, Camilla's once loyal circle began to fracture. Whispers of betrayal, emotional meltdowns, and leaked memos painted a picture of a queen under siege, not from the outside world, but from inside her own palace. What was meant to be a grand moment of royal symbolism had devolved into a crisis of legitimacy, ripping through Camilla's inner circle like a storm no one could contain. The cracks appeared quietly. Aides who had polished her public image for years were suddenly scrambling, their strategies collapsing under public outrage and weakening internal support. Behind closed doors, Camilla's temper erupted with a ferocity few had ever witnessed. Sources inside Clarence's house reported she snapped at longtime advisors, furious that the crown portrait narrative had slipped through her fingers. She demanded answers. How had Anne seized control of the palace so effortlessly? Why had Catherine's quiet elegance overshadowed her carefully orchestrated image? And the question that cut the deepest, why wasn't the nation sympathizing with her? Internal memos circulated, first defensive, then panicked. One note, allegedly written by Camilla herself, read, "I am the Queen." Why did she get the sympathy? The The line was raw, revealing the center of Camilla's unraveling. A title can command protocol, but it cannot command hearts. And the harder she pushed to assert her authority, the more public sentiment leaned harder toward Catherine, who, by staying silent, had spoken louder than anyone else. As tension escalated, members of Camilla's inner circle began stepping away. Some refused to issue statements. Others whispered to journalists off the record, quietly framing the Queen's behavior as unstable. The media, already electrified by Anne's explosive defiance, now fed eagerly on leaks coming straight from Camilla's household. Her once loyal court splintered into three camps: those still fiercely devoted, those quietly withdrawing, and those cautiously aligning themselves with the rising wave building around Catherine. Feeling the shift, Camilla began to retreat. Public engagements were abruptly postponed due to health concerns, and her usual presence beside Charles grew conspicuously rare. Behind closed doors, she reportedly declined every meeting with press strategists, rejecting attempts to repair the narrative. Charles, torn between defending his wife and safeguarding the monarchy, tried to intervene. But every word he offered in Camilla's favor only amplified the family's cold silence toward her. Camilla felt abandoned, cornered, and worst of all, unaccepted, not only by the public, but by the very institution she had spent years trying to belong to. Her reminders to the press that she had been crowned by the king himself rang empty when compared to Catherine's effortless poise. The queen in title was losing her ground to the queen in essence. And Catherine, through it all, remained untouched, quiet, graceful, far above the spectacle. Her silence acted like armor, allowing the public to project strength, wisdom, and steadiness onto her without her having to say a word. And, watching from the shadows, knew Catherine's silence was more powerful than any statement. The monarchy was shifting, and Camilla was no longer at its heart. But the most stunning twist came when Anne took her mission straight to the man who set everything into motion, King Charles. At Windsor Castle, sister confronted brother in a moment no one could have imagined. Princess Anne stood before King Charles not to plead, but to demand. And the ultimatum she delivered left the king visibly rattled. This wasn't public. This wasn't filtered through aides or veiled notes. And summoned him personally, under the guise of a family matter of state. But once Charles arrived, he immediately realized this had nothing to do with protocol. It was about power, principle, and the preservation of their mother's legacy. And didn't hesitate. With the Queen's letter in hand, she presented her argument with the precision of a soldier and the fury of a daughter still loyal to an era of honor. She exposed the symbolism of Camilla's portrait, the dangerous rewriting of heritage, and the growing disillusion spreading through both the public and the palace. But then she delivered the blow Charles couldn't defend against. She invoked their mother's voice, literally, and placed the letter on the table between them and said firmly, "You know Mother would never have allowed this." There was no accusation, only undeniable truth. Charles attempted to push back, insisting Camilla's status had been legitimized through the crown and embraced by the nation. But Anne sliced through his argument with quiet, devastating force. "No one crowned her the soul of this monarchy," she said. "And the people can see that." Charles tried reasoning, suggesting the crisis was purely a matter of perception, not reality. He warned they couldn't appear divided from within. But Anne was 2 steps ahead. She reminded him the monarchy was already fractured. The only question left was whether he would lead with courage or cling to the comfort of denial. As her words settled, Charles reportedly fell silent. What began as a conversation transformed into a reckoning, and continued. She told him she had kept their mother's letter private out of respect. But if he refused to act, she would have no choice but to make it public, not to disgrace the crown, but to save it. Her message was unmistakable. The era of quiet compliance was over. This was about restoring the monarchy's moral spine. And if Charles couldn't uphold that responsibility, Anne would take it upon herself. The room stayed suspended in silence for what felt like an endless stretch of time. Charles, shaken to his core, stood clutching the letter, reading and rereading his mother's final words as if hoping they might change. There were no raised voices, no angry exits, only the chilling realization that a royal legacy was being challenged by the very daughter who had once vowed to defend it above everything. But that confrontation didn't stay confined within palace walls. Because the very next morning, a leaked royal schedule sent shockwaves through the nation. Without warning, the palace unveiled a new ceremonial assignment, one traditionally held only by the queen herself. And the woman chosen to represent the monarchy was not Camilla. It was Catherine. The public gasped. The media erupted. And had delivered her message unmistakably, not through speeches, through action. The announcement appeared quietly in the early hours on the royal website, but its impact was anything but quiet. Catherine, Princess of Wales, was appointed to represent the crown at a global peace summit, an honor historically reserved for the reigning monarch or their consort. But Camilla's name was conspicuously absent. The timing was too sharp to ignore. Only days after Anne's seismic confrontation with Charles. Only days after the portrait scandal. The meaning couldn't have been clearer. The crown's future face would be defined by grace, not ambition. By dignity, not deflection. And the world would see that face in Catherine. Inside royal circles, whispers began to harden into certainty, and hadn't merely suggested the shift, she had demanded it. Insiders revealed and had spent days in back-to-back meetings with senior aides following her confrontation with the king. Her influence, once subtle, rarely exercised, had suddenly become the engine of change. And Catherine, hesitant at first, ultimately accepted the role with her signature calm resolve. Resolve. It wasn't a promotion in title, but in presence, and that presence echoed across continents as Catherine stepped onto the summit stage, surrounded by senior royal advisors and global dignitaries. Her arrival conveyed a message no proclamation ever could. This was the woman carrying the monarchy into its next chapter. Meanwhile, Camilla, absent from every engagement that week, remained sealed behind palace walls. No statement. No denial. Nothing. And that silence screamed louder than any official response. Inside Clarence's house, her team scrambled to regain control of the narrative, but the momentum had already shifted. Public polls surged in Catherine's favor. Newspapers across Europe and the Commonwealth wrote of a rightful queen rising. And in that defining moment, Camilla's name didn't disappear, but it dimmed. Overshadowed. Outpaced. The role had shifted, and the public knew it. This wasn't a simple ceremonial adjustment. It was a tectonic shift in royal power. But it wasn't the title, or even Catherine's appearance, that sealed the moment. It was her voice. Her speech, gentle yet precise, didn't glorify power or ancestry. It spoke of duty and legacy. Service, she said, is not inherited. It is lived. The hall, packed with world leaders and international press, rose to its feet. Not just applauding, chanting her name. It was a scene the monarchy hadn't witnessed in decades. Not since Diana. Not since Elizabeth. And standing quietly in the rear, watched not with triumph, but with profound relief. The message had reached its mark. Her mother's legacy had finally found its rightful bearer. But in the shadows of this victory, another storm gathered. Camilla was preparing her counterstrike. Just when it seemed the tide had fully turned, she launched a final move that sent shockwaves through the palace, an act of royal retaliation camouflaged in tradition. But Anne was ready. And as the nation held its breath, the monarchy's future stepped off the cliff and onto the brink of war. After Catherine's ascent, Camilla all but disappeared from public life. No appearances, no statements, no attempts to salvage her image. But behind the stone walls of Clarence's house, a strategy was already forming. In a move that astonished even her most loyal aides, Camilla allegedly ordered arrangements for a private, unsanctioned coronation tour. Not as a tribute to Charles's reign, but as a symbolic reclamation of her own queenship. She intended to travel alone, adorned in royal regalia, visiting key Commonwealth nations in what her aides internally labeled a revival of loyalty. But others inside the monarchy saw it for what it truly was, a political coup in open daylight. queenship. She planned to travel alone, draped in full royal regalia, visiting key Commonwealth nations in what her aides privately labeled a revival of loyalty. But to many inside the monarchy, it looked far more dangerous, a coronation coup unfolding in broad daylight. Senior palace aides were appalled. The idea of a solo, coronation-themed tour, without the king, without formal authorization, without the royal council's approval, was unthinkable. It shredded protocol. It fractured unity. And it challenged the very system the monarchy depended on to remain intact. But for Camilla, this was her final gamble. She knew Charles's health was under scrutiny, his popularity declining, and his control over the throne loosening with every passing week. If she could reach the public first, control the imagery, reclaim sympathy, she believed the crown beneath her feet might stop shaking. Her team worked at lightning speed, choosing destinations, preparing outfits, drafting speeches. But they overlooked one fatal obstacle, and was far from finished. The moment Anne heard whispers of Camilla's covert plan, she called an urgent meeting not with Charles, but with senior royals who had remained silent until now. She carried the letter, her mother's letter, and read it aloud. The room didn't erupt. It froze. For many present, it was the first time they understood this was not a dispute about optics or rivalry. It was about principle. It was about truth. With the Queen's wishes exposed to more than just, and the room split. Two clear factions emerged, those who upheld legacy, Anne, Catherine, and the loyalists to the Queen's ideals, and those who clung to entitlement, rallying behind Camilla in hopes that power might someday trickle down to them. Catherine, admired by both sides, suddenly found herself in the eye of the storm. Her silence, once praised, was now interpreted differently by every faction. Some considered it strength. Others saw hesitation. But Catherine refused to be used. She turned down interviews, issued no statements, and quietly withdrew to her family, leaving the political battlefield to burn without her. Yet, even in her absence, her image rose higher. She became the embodiment of dignity in a monarchy ripping itself apart. The media devoured the chaos. Royal commentators dubbed it the War of the Crowns. And behind the palace gates, the weight of the Queen's legacy trembled in uncertain hands. As whispers thickened into predictions, one truth became undeniable. What began as a quiet resistance had transformed into a royal reckoning no crown could contain. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.